Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Anne Longley. I'm the founder of Something New Together. We help organizations co-design their cultures and digital services, taking a long-term view that focuses on people and planet as well as profits. And I'm joined here today with the WiredSussex team to explore the work of Professor Anne Light. Anne, do you want to just say hi while I make your formal introduction, just so everyone knows who you are?
Hello, I'm Anne. Another Anne.
Yes, we're the A team and we share the same initials. So it's, yeah, we're happy to be here today. So Anne is the Professor of Interaction Design, Social Change and Sustainability at Longley University, and also the Professor of Design and Creative Technology with the University of Sussex. And she specializes in participatory design and eco-social innovation with a focus on future making and creative practice for transformations to sustainability. What I understand that to mean is that you explore, Anne, how designers who think in visionary ways can be agents for transformation. What a great focus for your life's work. We're here to explore your research and forthcoming book, Designs to Reshape Humanity, Integrity and Cunning in the Anthropocene, which is the most recent period in our Earth's history when human activity is starting to have an impact on the Earth's climate and ecosystem. Essentially our current time where us humans are destroying the planet. Anne is a great visionary and an inspiring thinker and doer, and you're highlighting where, you know, that we're now in danger, but also showing us signs and giving hope for a way forward, something we all need now more than ever. Your research focuses on helping us all become more resilient and sustainable and likely to avoid extinction. I love the fact that you're drawing a line in the sand, or the Pebble Beach as we're here in Brighton, saying that we need to rebuild our cultures and helping us explore how we might do it. This approach really chimes with my beliefs that culture, i.e. our values, beliefs and behaviors, determine our outcomes and impacts. A lot of what we do is unconscious, and by understanding our values, we can make sure our behaviors are congruent. This is important, but can be difficult work in my experience. This event is the final one in a series by WiredSussex and the University of Sussex, matching 3 of their academics with tech leaders and here in Brighton and the wider area that WiredSussex covers, to share their research and ignite conversations relevant, you know, for a global audience. And please share where you're from if you haven't already, so we really get a sense of all the different perspectives here. Our intention is to spark new ways of thinking and doing relating to design, technology, and innovation informed by Anne's work, in particular to explore how design can help improve the world and address climate change and other social problems. I've really been enlightened by the series so far, and I've been referencing it already in my work, and I hope you all find it as useful as I have. I really believe the tech community has much to gain from academia and vice versa. We can all learn from each other. My job is to act as a bridge between the academic world and the design and tech community. So I'm doing my best in that role. For me, you know, the opportunity to explore this topic with Anne is a real gift, and with all of you as well. It's very much aligned with my beliefs and purpose and sense of where we are now. I'd like to thank Phil Jones and Rifa of WiredSussex for inviting me to take part, and also to the Economic and Social Research Council for supporting this work, and the University of Sussex as well. Now, before we get into the roundtable discussion, I'll just go over a few little housekeeping items, and perhaps these may go in the chat as well. You can adjust the view of how you're seeing all the faces with the triple dots in the menu to the bottom right of your screen. Have a play with that. Also, you can turn on captions if you want captions. And there's many different languages to choose from. If you have any technical queries, Anna Bagley or Rifa from WiredSussex are here to help. We're scheduled to have the discussion go till 6:30, but if you have to drop off at 6, that's absolutely fine. We're going to stay on though, and we will be here to answer questions and keep the conversation going. Please mute yourself unless you're speaking, but please do use the chat function freely. It would be really great to hear your ideas. I think this is such a big topic, and we're going to have a lot of insight from participants, and if you have ideas on how design can help change the world, we definitely want to hear from you. And it would be amazing if we could crowdsource ideas and tips from participants. I'm going to get the ball rolling with a few questions, and then we'll open up the stage, so to speak. And I'm going to take one of the quotes from your work and then ask you a few questions in relation to it. And this quote for me really stood out because it is that drawing a line in the sand, so to speak. Design in its extreme functionality and service to big industry is both the handmaiden of devastation and the possible means of changing this fate. Our practice needs to propel us out of current modes of thinking. None of us here, I'm sure I can speak for everyone, wants to be the handmaidens of devastation. But equally, it can feel quite overwhelming to know where to begin. You've given us some really good pointers in your talk, but I'd love us to explore further your thoughts and ideas, especially for people that may not have seen the talk and are new to your thinking. So the first question I want to ask is, how might we change the current modes of thought, which often seem very individualistic, very short-sighted? How do we shift to a longer-term thinking based on clear values and an understanding of the consequences and implications of what we're doing to the world?
Oh, thanks, Anne. I always feel, I mean, when talking about, I hadn't really appreciated just how devastating the term handmaid of devastation actually becomes, or handmaiden of devastation. But one of the challenges with design is that it's very often very enmeshed with how the business world works. And that is also very enmeshed with things like shareholder reporting and things that operate on a very, very short-term basis. And when we look at how communities think in terms of design, often it's in terms of thinking about a generation or a lifetime. So we're talking potentially about 17 years or 80 years as kind of metrics for that. And so we see a real contrast there between two completely different ways of thinking. And as we look at things like the IPCC warnings that I think this is already now 2 years ago, so I think we have about 9 years before we're supposed to be looking at baked in environmental changes that mean that we're not going to be able to control our environment even as far as we can. We're looking at lots of different temporalities and ways of thinking about time. And my own feeling is that as we think about how we progress and we recognize that things are going to change, the big certainty is change rather than the status quo and what we have now. So then the question is, how do we design for something that we don't know? How do we start to design to help people to move and feel more comfortable moving than staying put? What does it mean to be happy with transition and welcoming the idea of discovering what we can be rather than clinging to what we know because it's a safer mode than what an unknown future offers? And that means that a lot of people in the design world who are used to having a set of skills that they can practice and materials that they're used to working with are also being thrown into that uncertainty to ask what their practice could be. But as designers, we're people who are really interested in how transformation happens. That is our material. And we may have particular focus for it, but we are interested in how the world can change. And we have that sense of imagining how things can be different, along with futurologists and politicians and people who perhaps exercise it in different ways. So for me, I think it's really potent to be starting to ask these questions, not just about how we deal with specifics of low carbon futures, but how we take our whole world with us in fair and just ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's can be quite difficult to imagine how we as individuals, citizens, employees tackle, you know, the magnitude of changes that we need to make in our society if we're to become more sustainable. And I'm just wondering if there's any examples that you've seen, Anne, that really inspire you and think, you know, point towards a way forward, or other aspects of your practice that can help us kind of get moving and actually start to build confidence that we can make a difference.
Well, at the moment, we've seen massive differences taking place in society anyway. They weren't things we chose, but having just responded as a world to coronavirus more or less effectively, but we have responded. I think there's abundant evidence around us of how we can make changes quite fast where there's a will. And I've personally been really inspired by the degree of kind of mutual aid. I think Brighton's been exemplary in that respect. I think Brighton and Cardiff were singled out as two of the cities in the UK that really responded to the challenges by also coming together and working out mechanisms for supporting each other. And in that, we see something which actually didn't cost a lot, apart from some energy and some thought and some care. And if we can mobilize like that for something, then that is transferable. Everyone could be doing that. And it just already creates an environment where people feel that they can afford to fall back on the neighborhood, or trust in that things can change and be better as well as worse. So for me, there's something really important here about not expecting to get to the end point by setting off now with that as a clear vision, but actually working on the structures that will help us become more agile, more flexible, not in a ever ready to serve the god of capital, but just in that sense that we are resourceful in a generous and collaborative way. I mean, you and I both come from a background of participatory work, and we know that if an individual tries to do something, it's really different than when a group sets their mind on something. It can be more laborious to negotiate, but it can also actually provide you with the sense of community and will and support that you need. And it just is a different experience. So for me, it's something very much about reflecting together and going forward together that's really important.
That point about reflecting, you know, and having time to have those conversations to really focus, I think is an interesting one, because I think we can all relate, and we've all seen examples of our communities mobilizing during the pandemic and providing mutual aid and support. I do wonder the extent to which people are actually reflecting on the implications of that and what that actually means in terms of what the capabilities of these groups really is. Do you think we're good at doing that, or what do you think is the current state of play?
My own feeling at the moment is that we're just in a pressure cooker, and that as soon as the lid comes off and we're allowed out again, and everyone will just go bouncing around through the summer, and that there won't be a lot of reflection, there'll be a lot of partying. But that said, I mean, my next ambition would be to work out how, once we can start to see how these things are playing out, what that can mean, and lead in reflection for that kind of thing, because there's so much to be learned from just having seen how change has affected people. And of course, it's been absolutely disastrous for some areas of the country and some people. And, you know, we need to think about, you know, food distribution and support for people. There's been rising use of food banks in a really crippling way for some communities. So, you know, it's far from something which we can all come out of feeling we succeeded and we're sort of elated by. But there is so much to learn from it that I think it may not be a summer of reflection, but maybe we go into autumn to start to think about what this means for us.
Just picking up on the chat, Debbie asked if you could elaborate on more details of what you saw in Brighton and Cardiff. Well,
I didn't see anything in Cardiff. I just read the newspaper article praising Brighton and Cardiff, but in Brighton, I mean, I live in an area which immediately looked at who was vulnerable, who was housebound, developed a rota. People went shopping for each other. People who felt fit enough were going to do tasks for people who felt vulnerable. If people were found to be ill, then people would rally around and support. So there was a real sense of quite apart from the sort of general things where people would kind of, my birthday party ended up being under an umbrella in the street with a whole bunch of other people who happened to be born, celebrate their birthdays around the same time, which wasn't at all how I'd expected to spend last summer either. But so this sort of sense of people just pooling resources, supporting each other, finding things for each other as needed. It's quite a good area like that anyway. We have a Facebook group that supports each other, but it went into overdrive, drew up rotas, kind of dealt with it.
I'm also very inspired, and my heart's warmed by everything that's been done. I do wonder though about how this process of reflection and how that is going to happen, and whether that will turn into or link up with existing social movements. I guess that's what I'm wondering, is how we use our design skills, I suppose, to propel things forward. I suppose in a way that's what I'm wondering about. And also for people that kind of actively use their design skills to not, contribute to devastation.
Yes, and so there's a whole tier above just reacting in the moment to looking at how we might build social structures that support our transitions. And one of the things that I want to just pay reference to is the fantastic work. We're talking about the kind of ad hoc development of community that happened during the pandemic, but there are some fantastic projects around the country, and some which are much bigger now, such as Transition Towns, which might not identify itself as a design movement, but when you look at the amount of designing that goes into it and the thought with which materials are developed. I was part of a pop-up 2030 workshop just a couple of weeks ago, and the whole thing is just takes you across a threshold into the future. You collaborate with people to think about how everything from housing to food to governance to creativity to ritual might be different, and then you sort of enact some of it in terms of design, and then you step back and reflect on what you have learned from the future to bring back into getting ready for it now. And those kinds of mechanism, I mean, I've also, in my talk, I talk about some stuff that I developed independent of that, about looking at how we can understand the present differently by thinking about potential forks that could have happened in the past. And if we'd taken a different route, where might we be now? And I've talked about the designed, therefore designable nature of the world. But I think that's one of the most important things that we can all be doing, and with different types of resource. But the idea that things do not have to be the way they are. They didn't have to be this way. They've evolved this way, and some of it is stuff that we're not happy about. I mean, there's all the kind of exploitation, the running down of worker rights, quite apart from the devastation we're seeing in the environment, extractivism. There are a whole lot of things, parts of the world where we know that things are not, that things are not even as just as here, where we're, fighting to maintain the right to protest, even at the moment in Britain. So with all those sorts of things, there are a whole lot of contextual things that's really important for people to be able to get a perspective on, that these things didn't just happen this way, that they were created this way by people, and some of these things were really kind of energy towards betterment, and some of these were just kind of power overriding things. And having an understanding of that and how things can still be different, I think, is crucially important. So for me at the moment, one of the challenges is, how do designers look beyond material to actually what is the stuff of culture? And when you was talking about values and beliefs and practices and behaviors, how are we supporting people to really And this comes to the, I mean, I always think it's a bit hubristic to talk about designs to reshape humanity, but my sense at the moment is that we've got a bit blousy. We're taking up more resource than we can afford to use. We're letting practices run pell-mell that we would not have accepted even 50, 20 years ago. You know, what do we have to do now as groups, as nations, as a world to start to improve on that and be better species?
I think that's something that we are all questioning, and I really am interested in, how this, this is kind of a fundamental question. Does anyone who's participating have any answers to what Anne has just said? It's quite daunting. I mean, the questions that come to my mind are, do we have to kind of take a stand in terms of our work, draw our own line and say, there's certain things I'm going to do and there's certain things I'm not going to do? I'd be interested in hearing, people who are on the call, if they care to share whether they've made such decisions or how they tackle, being in alignment with your values. Karen, I think you've put your hand up. I would love to hear from you.
Hi, yeah, I'm kind of a sort of slightly interloper here, because I have got sort of some digital projects, but I mostly work in outdoor arts, making performances and installations around the environment, sustainability. And I think I came to it from kind of politics and economics, believe it or not. And I think that was about making political changes that I wanted to see seem to be impossible in the kind of forums that we're allowed. But I believe that kind of art and culture kind of offers a greater potential for that. So that's what I'm kind of striving to do. I think one of my questions is, or one of the things that I've realized is that I can only limit a very small amount of things. And obviously living in Brighton, everyone sort of, there's no point. I mean, I don't really work here generally because everyone's on the same page, but it's how do you reach into those communities and kind of, change the way that people think about things. And in particular, when you were just talking about, the kind of devastation, the use of resources, I was thinking about America, which is the heaviest users. I mean, how on earth could I influence, so it's just not even worth trying. So it's kind of, I do what I can, but I don't try and overstretch. That sounds ridiculous.
But it feels like if we work locally and we locally try and lessen our impact, and all these different community groups that are set up are working in the same way, you can see things starting to get momentum. And then where my mind goes is I start thinking about, well, imagine if all these groups were connected by technology and we really were working together for common aims and reflecting. And, it doesn't even need to be a centralized thing. It could be a decentralized movement, but technology could really connect up these different groups and these different initiatives. And I guess that's what I don't know, I guess it comes down to us as individuals to use our leadership skills to, to step up and try and make a difference. I don't know if anyone else wants to share. Tricia, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I may as well speak it instead of read it. But I'm quite interested. It feels like and I think part of it's because of COVID, in this time of real, getting to the mutual aid, activism. There's so much activity happening in our kind of local lives, in our kind of hyper local lives, yet so much of how society where we've ended up basically is by political and kind of policy decisions. So it feels like there's like a big gulf between that. And while technology might fill some of that buffer and innovation and kind of big ideas, it can feel, I think, at the sort of grassroots level, feel a bit futile and a bit stunted. And yeah, I'd be really keen on just your thoughts on kind of how kind of we as individuals who are thinking about these issues, like is there any hope or is it futile?
Well, I mean, First of all, I think that a life lived doing this kind of stuff at local level is just a more enjoyable life. So I think, you know, that's not, instead of affecting a bigger context or a bigger scale. But I had an experience. I was teaching this week and showing lots of examples of what one might call kind of, you know, being the change you want to see, where groups were doing something like, there's a, I was looking at Ashton Hayes in Cheshire, where they've managed to bring their energy footprint right down. I was showing them about transition towns. We were looking at Incredible Edible in Todmorden in Yorkshire, just as examples of way that people have designed from the bottom up. And initially the students are quite skeptical, and they're going, well, that doesn't make much difference. And we started talking about the fact that it's about, you know, is it 100 companies that are causing about 70% of the kind of problem, and that their kind of incumbency is such that they just are so large that they can always shift a little bit and move a little bit, and they and keep a stranglehold on governments to a large extent. And then as they were looking at how the community is built through these mechanisms at neighbourhood level, the students started to say, but of course, that's really changed their political power and their political interest, because they've seen what can be achieved and they really care, and they're doing something together, and they've become quite powerful as a unit of several thousand people. And they're not now prepared to watch somebody else ruin it. So I think there's you know, we have to see ourselves as very small parts of something that is actually starting to happen worldwide. And what I like about being in design at the moment is that designers aren't elected. They have the skills to be able to inspire and visualize and work with people to envision. But the problem with a lot of the leaders that we have in formal places is that they're all stuck in short-term kind of democratic spaces that, I mean, I'm a great fan of democratizing, but I think that democracy can get a bit stuck when you need to make radical change of the kind that perhaps artists, visionaries, philosophers are thinking about, but politicians are just trying to hold things stable so that that kind of stuff can take place. Then a new kind of leader comes in and helps move everything forward to the point where something new can be born. And that's what I feel it needs to be happening at the moment. And the designers are the people, the artists, the philosophers are the people who can be helping. And that's why we can also be handmaidens to something more lovely being born.
Yeah, it's actually a lovely way of putting it. So thank you.
I'm quite inspired. There's a few people who've raised their hands, so I'm going to come to you in a sec. I'm quite inspired by the convergence of you know, corporate responsibility and sustainability, the sustainability agenda. And I know, you know, people can be cynical, there can be greenwashing, we have to be careful, but there is quite a big appetite in corporates making a difference. Also, the younger generation in particular want to be working for companies that are having positive social and environmental impacts. And that is one of the reasons why the focus of the work that Debbie and I do, and Debbie's on this call as well, is really focused on helping align the culture with that longer term view. Because if more and more companies start taking that wider agenda and perspective, we can start to really build that momentum. And also the growing use of coalitions, people working in a coalition way where they're joining up initiatives. Tina Woods does that in health. I know Kane Eula, I don't know if he came on this call, but his agency, Red Badger, they listen to their employees, the generation of young designers and technologists, and they don't want to be having negative impacts in their work. So they've created Mission Beyond as part of their company ethos to the employees to look at different areas such as social mobility, mental health, and they join up with other initiatives and do design work on these subjects. So I just think there's so much, and we're at such a great time when change can really happen. Sarah, I know you have something to say.
I thought the comment about, like, you know, how do you help those leaders be born was a really interesting question, because it started to make me think about the sort of industries that they all exist in. And I think we're now moving to a model where we are looking more at interdisciplinarity and how you have academia working with industry, working with the arts. But I think there's a real challenge when, like, how do you exist between all of those different things, and how do you nurture people unless they are within those these sort of normal models? You know, like, say I want to like research innovation and do my PhD on it, and then you go on and you do a postdoc, and then that's the way that you graduate. But it's still a very hierarchical model, rather than how do we find, you know, ways that we can make it easier to support people that perhaps are outside of these normal models, because that's the whole point of innovation, right? We want to do something that is new and exciting and interesting, but actually I think it can be really limiting in, you know, how do you do this unless you're also like really privileged? Like, the idea of being an entrepreneur is like quite hard unless you've got like people throwing money at you from the beginning, or you're, you know, juggling all these different jobs that perhaps aren't even aligned with what you want to do. And so I just think I'd be interested in people's thoughts of like how people have started on their journeys, or how they have been able to do work that is cross-disciplinary, or, you know, finding collaborators along the way. Because I think it can be really challenging as well. Like in my work, then I guess, well, I didn't get onto my PhD, so I tried to turn it into a business. But I find it really interesting, like the process of trying to work with academia, like the process that it takes from finding like the right person that's like interesting and really aligned with you, and then you have to build that relationship and then work out like what is the thing that we both find really interesting, and how can we distill that into a question that then we could apply for funding for. Meanwhile, how is our time covered? And like, how do you actually like nurture that? And then there's all these questions. Sorry, I realize I'm rambling a bit, but like, and then there's all the questions about like, who owns this? And is it just going to be a piece of research that gets published and then like stays in like on a shelf in a lab? Or how do you like go on to commercialize that? And I think now is a really interesting time where we are seeing more of these creative research companies, but finding places for them to sit and making sure that it's actually like a diverse bunch of people doing it, I think needs to be addressed more.
Any thoughts, Anne? Because, you know, it's not for the faint-hearted to do this type of innovation, but maybe that's why your book is about cunning and integrity.
I mean, it's interesting to hear you talk about academia, which is far from a perfect environment for developing anything. It's definitely a legacy from a different way of thinking about creating knowledge. It works very well for kind of big scientific questions where you can marshal perhaps large sums from funders. But when it comes to being able to do things that border between culture and design and arts and things like that, yeah, it is quite difficult. The resourcing is really challenging. So I don't think there's a simple answer to that, other than finding the people who are interested in that. So I think that there's some really serious questions that we could ask about what the future of the university should be, and that is part of some of the questioning we should be doing. It's a very large institution that takes a lot of money and top slices a lot of it, and then offers it out in kind of packages that aren't not always particularly useful for the people who are trying to do something different. So that may not be the most agile or useful form for doing research. I think there's a lot to be said for being in small and flexible structures at the moment. And when we're talking about, well, what actually works, being able to have kind of multiple existences with kind of a foot in several doors actually seems to be the way that, in as much as we're looking, this means I have to introduce a whole other team because it's not part of the book as such. But I've got a colleague here as well who I'd be very pleased to introduce in this capacity. But I'm part of a project called Creatures, which stands for Creative Practice for Transformative Futures. And in that, we've been working with a lot of cultural producers and artists, and they are very small, and they kind of almost hover above the land that they work on by connecting and staying staying very mobile, keeping abreast of everything that's going on, a hand in academia, a foot in business, and they get to be very creative because they're already creative in their structure. And that's asking a huge amount, because that requires you not only to be thinking all the time about how you can innovate the thing you want to innovate, but you're constantly innovating yourself and the way that you exist in the world. And it's hugely demanding, but it's also very interesting to see that there are bodies that can operate like that and what they're creating. And that's to some extent what we're studying at the moment to see how they make that work. And I think it's really interesting, Sarah, if I can come back to your experience, that you were sort of poised to do a PhD and then it became a business. Sounds as if you're actually one of those people who is able to read the environment and work out how something is going to move most creatively for you. It isn't always where you think it's going to be, because everything changes, something gets closed down. At the moment, we're experiencing really sharp cut in funding because of some of the things that the government's sort of, having said it was going to do kind of big research, having left Europe, it's now going to be doing small research. So, you know, that's how it goes. So we might be saying, okay, universities are not going to be the most fertile places for this. So where's the new site of this? Is it small design companies that can be calling their briefs to account, that can be turning back to the people who are booking them and saying, you know, you're going to be on the wrong side of history in 2 to 3 years. What are you going to do about it? That might be a much better place to be than in a university at this point. But we do what we can from the university, you know, we do what we can.
It's very interesting, this conversation. I love the idea of the creatures, almost like these this force, invisible force that's going around disrupting organizations. I don't know if that's what you meant, but that's kind of where my mind started to go, because it's like you know, this is where like design is such a powerful tool set. And the work, it's unfortunate Debbie is having technical difficulties, because you know, we work with companies that want to be disrupted and transform themselves and actually work on their cultures and work to be fit for purpose with what their strategy is and where they actually are. And, you know, being conscious and aware and just starting to have conversations, I think that's where it's really all got to begin. And then once we have those conversations, those really brave conversations where we actually call out some of the shortcomings of our current practices, it's only then that we are going to be able to start doing it differently. So this kind of disruption mindset that you often get in legacy organizations, it often relates to technology. I think it needs to go into culture as well. And I think we can be the champions for that kind of disruptive mindset where we start questioning. And then it starts to get very exciting, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree, but I suppose I kind of maybe returning to where you started. I'm not sure it's so much as disruption as looking for spaces that haven't been appropriated or ruined or spoiled, and working out what can be constructed in those spaces that is beautiful and kind and gentle and careful. Because even the idea of disruption is from a kind of, I mean, if we think about the kind of break everything and then something new will be born, the kind of California ideology, that really lives in a world that is quite callous. And a lot of what I really respect about what's being developed is that I'm going to cite the Craftivist manifesto, because I just love it, and I just think, you know, this is how I would like my work to be. But you know, if you want the revolution to be kind and beautiful and gentle, then the means of conducting the revolution have to be kind and, you know, and gentle and beautiful, because otherwise you create more trauma. Now we're all reeling from all kinds of different traumatic events across, you know, I mean, I suspect that for a lot of people, you know, 2008 and the financial crash or the pandemic will be marked, you know, in their sort of sense of their life story as really disrupted times. So what I would like to be thinking that these kind of agile and creative units are doing is using their integrity and cunning to make the best of what's there and to show what can be there, and to woo people and seduce them into trusting to change rather than disrupting things because that's very abrupt, and that becomes scary, and that is again quite sort of shocking, I think. So without wishing to negate anything that you were saying, I'm just thinking, you know, it makes me aware that actually the values we want to put out there are the ones that we want to live by.
Yeah, I think those are fair comments. I mean, it's really interesting because I don't necessarily see disrupt as having negative connotations, and I certainly the way, and this is just, you know, maybe me being unaware, but equally it does chime with some of my experience, which I'll come on to in a sec. Because of the type of person I am, I would think the type of disruption that I would want to bring is a more people-friendly and respectful and you know, sustainable type of disruption. But I love what you said about you know, making it beautiful, making it a positive experience. As my mother always said, you know, sugar goes farther than vinegar. So it's almost like, and this is, you know, very interesting when we think about, you know, dealing with misogyny or any kind of like injustice in the workplace. You know, if you've got to keep your grace, and you've almost got to be the higher being and use your kind of cunning and charm and creativity, I guess, to get things to go your way. But I don't know, I sometimes think we have to call stuff out as well, you know, name it, claim it, stop it. And
there, I think I would also like to make a distinction. I mean, I'm also somebody who helped, you know, led a project to create something called Everyday Disruptions and coined the term gentle disruption for possibly exactly this. So now I'm thinking, you know, this is nearly 10 years ago, but have I changed my mind? And no, I think I agree with you, Anne, that disruptions are great, but they just have to manifest in ways that are gentle. Otherwise, they don't serve a purpose. And when it comes to calling things out, I think you call them out. I don't think that we should be charming our way through injustices, but I do think that it's, I mean, I'm so off topic here. There are specialists in this kind of stuff, but for me, these are sort of, it's about knowing your ground and being very sure of yourself about wanting something to be better and not taking things. But also what I really like about what I see happening in the design and creative spaces is that there are stakes made and new things are created that show what can be. And by doing that, it's not just rejecting injustice, but it's actually modeling something that is an attractor for people who might want it to be that way. And what is interesting then is there might be lots of different kinds of attractor, and some people will be drawn to one kind and some to a different kind. And my concern then becomes, how do these still manage to speak to each other? There's a lot being talked about, for instance, at the moment about kind of everybody having their own world, this kind of idea of a world in which many worlds fit, which is very respectful. But can those worlds still talk to each other? And if we want to work together and improve the planet as a physical manifestation, then we can't get so lost in our small worlds that we can't communicate across them. But at the same time, the joy of future making, of world building, of doing something constructive together is actually what makes us most alive and most and happiest, because people love to make things, they love to connect with people, that's at our most vigorous. And that should manifest in lots of different ways rather than there be one way. And in fact, this is something that worries me a little bit about the way that sustainability rhetoric is often expressed. It's quite often that is about closing things down, doing less of something, being careful, moving into a smart city where everything is bounded and it does it for you, and everything, you know, it sort of is managed so that there can't be any kind of digressions. Well, that's not very human in the end. So part of the idea of actually thinking about humanity rather than just protecting humankind is that sense of, well, what makes us feel alive? What thrills us? What can we use to motivate people so their lives actually feel better?
I mean, just asking those questions, it feels so good, you know, to be asked. And this, you really reminded me of a strong belief I have, and hopefully, you know, it's something I try and do in my practice, is to get discussions going, get people talking, co-designing, co-creating a vision for the future, and then trying to get everyone to go in that direction. And sometimes you're given that brief. Sometimes you have to fight for that brief. And I think this is really like such an important thing that I really hope we all get out of this discussion, that we can actually make things happen and we can use our design skills. Like, I think it was the person that spoke first.
Karen.
Yes, about her artwork. You know, there's that whole, you know, history of using culture to jam you know, people's perceptions. I'm thinking adbusters, you know, all kinds of stunts that environmentalists have used for many years just to get people's attention, get them to stop, you know, in their tracks, whether it's like all the styrofoam cups we use in a day, or we don't use styrofoam anymore, but we're still, you know, using lots of disposable cups, and just, you know, getting people's attention down to, you know, taking a brief that we receive from a client, a design brief, and saying, hey, can we take a step back from this brief and maybe expand how we're gonna explore it? And having the confidence to actually question and challenge what we're given and to bring wider thinking, I think is something that, you know, we can all do. And, you know, you could even say it's our duty to do that if we care about the future. And that's where the awareness comes in, I think, about your values and trying to find that alignment. I'm really interested in hearing from people that are using sustainable design in their practice, and who might have some examples or thoughts on how we can actually, you know, use our skills to make a positive difference.
I can give it a go. Is that working?
Feel free to use the chat, Debbie. Sorry, we're not able to benefit from your wisdom today.
Can I just say that we have just benefited from your wisdom? I really liked what you'd written in the chat.
Yeah, constructive disruption, the act of predominantly challenging inherited wisdom or structure, supports innovation by opening up the space to replace what we have with what we might imagine.
Thanks, Anne, for reading it out, because I think it's very to the point. I mean, exactly that. I'd be really interested to know how many people are doing that kind of thing and how, but to my mind, it's exactly that reflective moment where you see how things can be moved. Yeah.
And do you want to talk about some of your workshops that you do? You've done the Some Other World workshops. I think they're a very quite inspiring example of, you know, creating a legacy and empowering people through a design experience.
I mean, about a few years ago, I decided that my mission was to see what could be done in the cultural space, rather, because I don't have, I have a background as a drama teacher and a designer of social process, not of I don't make stuff, so I couldn't sort of do the next wind turbine. So I was sort of looking at what could be developed, and the first one was a way of reflecting on what I was seeing in the way of kind of network technology connecting things up. But how might networks connect things up in a way that would actually allow us to use the knowledge that was being created in the world, so that it wasn't just sucked into some kind of central repository. Things come back to Sarah's point about what do universities do. Sometimes they just seem to hoover up knowledge and occasionally sort of belch it out into journals. But my question for people, and this was very much a thought experiment, was what would it look like if you had a world that was completely connected in information terms, and you could find out what was going on everywhere? How could you manage that? How could you use that? What would it enable? What would happen if your information went into the center and could be aggregated, and we could use deep, kind of learning and mining of data to produce kinds of knowledge that then came back out to the kind of points in the world where it would be useful? And of course, we have bits of that, and we have quite a lot of citizen science that looks a bit like that, and it can be, really successful, and in other places just very extractivist. But we don't have the whole world doing that, and if we did, we'd have lots of cultural problems and language problems and all kinds of understanding problems. But what would it look like? What would it feel like to have that as a thought experiment? So that was one series of workshops. Then the one I mentioned before was the idea that you can go back in time to a point where something might have been different and come forward again, so that you live with that fork in your head after doing the workshop. And that was the On Some Other World, which was based on the idea of counterfactuality, where something was different in the world. And what would it take for it to be different and better, or different and worse? And how might that make us think about how things could be different going forward? And I'm still developing one now, which was on kind of what matters. And I haven't tried this one out very extensively, but it starts with, you get a piece of ribbon and you can just pick one from a pile. And you have to say what it is that connects you to the world. What does this ribbon represent? And you get the most beautiful answers. It's not a very collective. The other two are very collective projects where you kind of like working with other people. But this, I found you can't really combine that, because everyone has a very personal sense of what connects them to the world and what's important. And then everyone took a little box, just random collection of boxes, and it said, something in this box is more precious than any kind of financial reward, than money. What is in this box? And the one that I really remember was a student turning around to me saying, like, my eyes were in that box. And the opportunity to just see the world and understand it and be part of it, that comes with being, you know, able to see. He said, my whole sense of what that meant was changed this morning by imagining them as the most precious resource I have. And then we had a big class discussion about what that was and what other things were of value and things like that. But as thought experiments, these kinds of things, and I'm not the only person generating this kind of stuff at all. I mean, if people are interested in it, then Joanna Macy's done some fantastic work for many years, and Transition Towns have picked up on that and developed their own kinds of exercises and all sorts of ways of visioning how things could be different culturally. They've been moving in that direction. But that's, my work has been very much trying to think, well, what is it that can give us that love in the moment that we might remember? What can we do in a workshop in 3 hours together that will be so memorable that in 6 months or 2 years you can quiz people about what they remember, and they will still talk about a particular moment where something shifted in their sense of what it was to be alive and what they were empowered to do. Not that I empowered them, but what they were empowered to do, but they hadn't necessarily recognized it, or they'd forgotten it. And there are little charges of that every so often just make so much difference to what we think we can do, how we can care about it, how we can embrace it. So for me, I'm just developing a suite of things that allow us to make those kinds of thought experiments.
Thank you, Anne. That was really inspirational, and I think there's so much we can do in creative workshops, and I've done a lot of work with young people over the years. When I was working in local government, we brought some students in for job shadowing for a day, and instead of just having them watch what we do, we actually brought them together for a design workshop, and we asked them, you know, what were their burning issues and what did they actually want help with that the local council could help them with? And after 2 hours, they were all sketching out solutions for their problems, which were big problems, including the environment, their social lives, and you know, their personal safety and their education and job opportunities. And they had sorted the whole world out. And I just think we don't ask people enough for their solutions and to create that vision for the future. And we all have it in us to actually define the future and what we need. It's just so rarely are we asked. And I think, this is my humble view, we should be much more vocal in championing that kind of participatory approach, because it leaves a legacy and it builds confidence, and we should all be confident, I think, in using our voice. Now, I'm very interested in asking Lorna to speak. Lorna, you've shared some information in the chat, and I would love it if you unmuted yourself and spoke to us about your project that you're doing.
Sure, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'm the project Economic and Social Research Council Impact Evaluation Account, which is held by Sussex. So it's a block grant for the Research Council, which is aimed at developing collaborative projects that bring about positive social change or I'll put any kind of results, societal results, as a result of academic collaboration with any kind of outside organisation. So it's really interesting to hear about what perceptions there might be from people on the other side, as it were, what the barriers are to, because we have funding, we'd like to develop projects from this series, and we have seed funding for those kinds of projects, and there are lots of other ways that we can support them, and we're working with academics to help them to be more focused on this kind of work. But it would be really interesting to hear what we could do differently and what we could do better in the short term, and obviously that might lead to a longer term change as well. Certainly we're kind of, these block grants are used by the ESRC as bellwethers for what's going on and to try to innovate. So we feed back to them all the time, and there's a possibility of that bringing about positive change. So yeah, I think it was talking about all the ways in which it's difficult.
Look, Lorna, thank you very much. We're having a bit of a difficulty hearing you, but thank you for asking that question. It's so lovely to hear people asking. And Sarah Tycho, I'd love you to come to the stage, because you've got a fantastic project, and your story has really moved me. Some of the challenges you've had, with the funding, because it's like, it can be quite challenging. So do you want to tell your story and talk about your work and your experience?
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you to say. Just wondering what I've even done. Yeah, I guess as a bit of background then, like I think I mentioned earlier, initially my company, Hatsumi, which means to see something for the first time, was going to be a PhD, which is an adaptation of an existing arts and health research method called body mapping, where you illustrate onto a body the embodied experience of pain and emotion. And my goal was to translate it into a virtual reality experience. So you can illustrate both inside the body, on the skin, and outside the body as a tool to be able to communicate the experience of pain and emotion to different stakeholders, so doctors and family members, be able to create pain journals over time to track how that might change, but also how it can be used in research as well, and what happens when you aggregate all this really fascinating qualitative data alongside more quantitative methods. And do men in Vanuatu illustrate pain in the same way that women might in Canada or whatever, and how you can use that to explore embodiment and sensory experience in a different way, but also how it can be used as a public engagement tool as well, and how we can kind of create these terracotta armies of lived experience and start to put them in galleries or squares and start a conversation with people about mental health and physical health. But I guess my interest in starting this is like, how do you do it as a startup if you're not going to be an academic? And it was really interesting speaking to other people working in VR and healthcare here in the UK of like, well, how does this work? Like, is there a system for being able to develop something, validate it through research, and then bring it into the NHS? And what we found is that it's just really siloed, and the research and industry and the arts aren't really talking. And so, as I think I mentioned like briefly in the chat, I ended up doing some research with Nesta a few years ago about some of these challenges of how do you make visually compelling, narrative-driven experiences that could help people with mental health problems, and why is it that there is this issue for in enabling these collaborations? And so one of the outcomes was designing, I don't think it's that imaginative, but it was like a nice start of just being able to create a funding call where it says, are you an artist or a startup that has an interesting idea, but you want to work with an academic? Then apply for this. You'll get £20,000 to develop a prototype, but also you'll be matched with a researcher from the psychology lab at Story Features in Royal Holloway. And then we'll also support you to scale that up and find investment. And I would like to think about like where do we go on from here as well, and create, I guess, like some sort of pipeline or journey from someone that's just interested and wanted to learn about these things to being able to find collaborators and do that research, but ultimately, you know, bring it to people instead of just talking about it and being able to present about these early ideas that you do at conferences, then everyone claps and says, well done, and then you go back to being a really underfunded startup. So it feels like an interesting moment, and yeah, we'll see where things go next, I guess.
Wow, and now I can see it would have been a fantastic PhD. It's like, absolutely, I mean, but that would still have had its limitations. It seems to be quite often that last mile where you can develop things as blue sky and then getting them actually into use. Particularly, I would have thought medical. Yeah.
I think this story is really illustrative of how we need to redesign some of these institutions. And, you know, this came up in Andy Sterling's chat with Natalie, the first in the series, the first roundtable, about how innovation gets funded. And it really needs a redesign. Now, if out of this session, you're able to speak with Lorna, that would be great. And I would love to hear how we can make this an enabler of that conversation. And I also know that Karen wants to speak as well. Now, Karen, you spoke up earlier. Do you want to say anything presently about some of your challenges with the brilliant work that you do?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've got 2 projects that are kind of going a bit like that at the moment. So my background is in outdoor arts, events, performances and things. And I've been creating work around sustainability. So I have a couple of different projects, both around bicycles and originally trying to stop people throwing bikes away, which was a huge problem, and kind of turning them into artworks and sticking them on the roofs of buildings and things. And then I have a performance company which has been touring for 15 years this year, which is the Bicycle Ballet Company. And as it's kind of gone on, and especially since the crash, the money's got tighter, but the money in for arts, the money towards cycling has kind of increased. So I've got more interested in this. How do we actually use the arts to kind of impact that? And I know that we kind of change the way, people think about cycling. Stereotypes around cycling is one of the biggest barriers, especially to women, for example. So I've been looking at how we can start to research that, and I'm part of a consortium of outdoor artists, which is just kind of getting off the ground, which will be looking at that in the 3 Bs, Brighton, Bradford and Bideford currently, and hopefully that will extend as we kind of evolve. So I'm looking at sustainability, someone else is looking at community, and someone else is looking at health and well-being. So quite different and very different communities, but that's just right at the start. And then the other project that I've been working on, which Anne has actually helped me with in terms of our evaluation, is a piece called the Living Coast Undersea Experience. And that's a virtual reality piece which takes you into the underwater environment of the Marine Conservation Zone. It's literally just off the coast. It runs from Brighton Marina to Beachy Head, and now recently extended to Hastings. And now with the kelp forest has gone all the way the other way as well, so it kind of goes towards sort of Bognor. So it's a huge area, and it's quite a unique environment in the world. It's basically the chalk cliff is a unique kind of feature, and there's all sorts of creatures and stuff there. And I started because I just wanted to see it, and it's evolved as a kind of education project. We've been touring it into community venues, and really quite, the initial evaluation, I mean, everything cut short by COVID, of course, but the initial evaluation was showing really positive impacts in terms of people's views about conservation, and, and just looking to develop that work as it goes forward, really. So those are my kind of 2 things.
It sounds amazing. I don't know if, I don't want to put Lorna on the spot, but Lorna, hopefully you can, I don't know if you have anything you want to say now, or...
I don't know if you can hear me a bit better now. Yeah, I mean, Karen, it sounds really fascinating what you're working on. So we look to, we've worked with, on projects, on helping to develop projects that are collaborations between academics, between researchers in social science fields, and anyone else in any field, to be across the whole gamut of business to policy to government to the sector. So if I can't I can't create a project, but we could look to matchmake with an academic who's interested in the field they're working at, and if indeed a project could be developed that would be relevant and interesting, so I'd be happy to continue the conversation.
I notice, thank you very much for that, Lorna. I notice Anna has just put a channel in Slack to follow up. I don't know if this will be for the whole program.
So part of this experiment, if you like, of this 3 series of events with Adrian Smith and Andy Sterling and Ad Light, was to take the conversation further. The whole thing about having all this research being done on our doorstep and not connecting with tech people and local artists and collaborating seems to be something that we needed to address. And so that's what this whole project was all about. So we just want to take it further. And so the Slack channel is there if you want to join it, and it's open to anyone. You don't have to be a WiredSussex member, and there are loads of other channels that you can join as well. But that particular channel we've created for anyone. So hopefully there'll be more people within the WiredSussex community that you can talk to as well.
That's absolutely fantastic, because I'm such a practical person. I think a lot of people working in business, it's all about, you know, takeaways, how we can apply things. And I started putting in, you know, 5 things people can do so we have takeaways. Just summing up some of the things that have come up in my conversations with Anne and in the conversation tonight. But having a Slack channel and potentially future events is a good thing. I also think, you know, I hope that there's a lot that academia and funders can gain from listening to people on the coalface, people such as Sarah and Karen, who are trying desperately and valiantly and amazingly to innovate, but yet, you know, it's not easy for them. Or just any of us who want to maybe go against the grain of the status quo, and when questioning that might be somehow, you know, might have unintended consequences. And I think those of us, you know, working in this space, we need support and kind of safety almost. So that's just something I wanted to mention. There's some things coming up in the chat. So Debbie asked about a question for Anne. If you had any thoughts on the Great Reset, which is being led by the World Economic Forum. Is that something that you think is, I don't know if it's on your radar. I believe it's like a policy initiative using the pandemic as a means to pause and reflect and reset.
Yeah, I'm not, what should we say? I know of it, and I didn't read up on it for this event. So let me just say that. But I mean, I think everything is really important, and it is exactly that we should be doing. But I want it also to happen in ways that are not managed from the top. So I think, you know, when we talk about the World Economic Forum, it doesn't get much larger and much more. I realise that, you know, I'm not anti-institution, so I'm just realising that, you know, having kind of criticised things that are happening, you know, the incumbents in fossil fuel, yes, I am critical of them, but I mean, it's really important that every tier is working. My interest is particularly in what we can do to move hearts and souls together, and not only to do less of things and be more careful, but actually find new practices that make society sort of still fun and glorious for those it has been fun and glorious for, and more fun and glorious for those people who have not found it that way in past years. So that of course I really welcome that. But when I see very large corporations talking this talk, I remain skeptical, because they also have to then do something that maybe needs to reinvent the material of their institution needs to be rethought. So as long as they're reflecting on that as well as on what we're supposed to be doing, I'm really pleased that, you know, that's going on. So, because I think for me, a healthy skepticism travels hand in hand with all this creative energy, and as we're hearing, the need for more spaces for people to be able to develop solutions that may or may not be solutions, that are just ideas, that are things that we can experiment with, because at the moment it's a kind of all hands on deck situation in terms of innovation. It seems a very bad time to be saying, oh, well, we can't fund this anymore. I mean, that's one of my frustrations with what's happened with funding in academia, because it is a very powerful place for creating new ideas. But when it gets cut back at a time when we should be innovating our way on every dimension to see what's useful. So yes, great that the World Economic Forum is taking it on board.
Thank you, Anne. I noticed we're running out of time, and we've actually rolled over our hour. We've only got 10 minutes left. Now, before I wrap up, I would just like to invite Derek Stewart to speak up, because Derek shared some great work that his agency is doing. What you've put in the chat, you work as a graphic designer, art director, promoting ethics and awareness in visual communication, and your studio was the first in Italy to become a B Corp. That's fantastic.
Yeah, no, that was a great achievement. Yeah, we were very proud of that. Yeah.
Yeah, this is exactly the kind of practical, because essentially what Anne is saying, if creators, we are visionaries, we can make a difference, and we can make a difference based on our values and the decisions that we make and the type of work that we do. So for me, you are exemplifying what we're trying to say here. Anne, I don't know if you have anything to add. So I'm just like, hat tip to you, that's great. And
thank you.
Keep going and doing what you're doing. It's absolutely
I mean, for us, it's been really important. I mean, designers, I don't think they realize the responsibility that they have. We're mainly geared into making things pretty and to make things look good. But there's so much that you can actually, it's more than that. Whereas before we were creating imagery and materials or whatever. What was behind it is the values that is behind the work. So positive change is our manifesto.
That's great. And I heard someone recently talk about what we need is manifestos, not briefs. And if we have manifestos which guide that reflect our values, our vision, where we're trying to go, and then that guides everything, that is going to really help us make a difference, as whether we're individuals or part of a collective or whatever organization we're working for. And then it also gives us, I think, confidence to have some of the challenging conversations that we're going to need to have to create this better future together. But to reflect also what Anne said, which I do love, in a beautiful way. In a beautiful, using our design skills, using our creativity and our cunning as well. Because I think cunning is really important. And I know we have to stop, but do you want to just talk a little bit, and thank you for that, Derek, and do you want to talk just a little bit about what you mean by the cunning integrity in the title of your forthcoming book, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Yes, so yes, forthcoming is just such a lovely thought, because I'm still writing it, so it's sort of forthcoming in terms of when I get round to it. But yes, there's a first draft, and what I mean by integrity and cunning, as people, we are always adapting to situations, looking out for things and trying to make them work. So that's a kind of cunning that I think is common across lots of different societies and ways of being. And if we just apply that, then it results in things like sort of accumulation and appropriation and things that are really not particularly lovely, but as well as some really clever initiatives. So the integrity is no use by itself, because that's kind of, the sort of decency that doesn't actually go anywhere. The cunning is, how do you make these kind of agile spaces that can be transformative? And the integrity is to do it to make a better world rather than just for your own benefit. So for me, it's those two qualities which are so, for me, really important about people, that we can believe in better, we can imagine, we can be visionaries, which is part of the integrity and part of the cunning. And how does that come together in ways that are practical and solve things like, paucity of funding opportunities, or, neighborhoods in distress, and, inequalities between regions, which, if we all start to just do our own thing, what happens to to join things back up. So on the one hand, we always have to kind of look local. On the other hand, we also have to think more broadly. And all of that, you know, requires considerable cunning and a lot of integrity. So that's how the terms came up as critical for dealing with the Anthropocene. Because even if we don't win all the climate battles, we're still going to be coexisting. And I would love to think we did it really well together.
I'm going to wrap up now. I want to thank everyone for their participation. I really do feel that this was a round table and that we got some different perspectives, and I hope we have some future conversations that come out of it. Lorna, thank you so much for stepping forward, and I'm just couldn't be happier. And Rifa, it's wonderful that there's going to be a Slack community. We don't have to stop now, we can keep going. I personally have really benefited from this program already, as I said before, and I hope we can keep the conversation going. So thank you, everyone, and
thank you, Anne. You've just been a lovely, there's a word I'm not going to be able to say now, person who asks questions. Thank you, and holds things together and makes them happen. Thank you.
Thanks very much to both Anne Light and Anne Longley for making this event so interesting for everyone. Thank you everyone for coming. This is a series of events as a joint venture with University of Sussex and WiredSussex, and it's made possible very much by funding from the Economic and Social Research Council.